Welcome back to Streaming Media East 2017, and I have a very special guest with me today. Avni, introduce yourself. Tell the audience what you do.
Thank you. I'm Avni Rambhia. I'm an industry principal with the Digital Transformation Group at Frost & Sullivan. I cover encoding and transcoding technologies as well as DRM and conditional access technologies.
Oh, fantastic.
So many exciting things happening in our world.
So let's talk DRM first. We'll take it sort of in reverse order. Christopher Levy was on just a moment ago. Matt Smith was on from Bright Cove. We talked about sort of the difference between encryption and DRM, and Christopher did a good job of explaining how encryption fits within. What's the state of DRM these days? It seems like paywalls are coming down, which may mean that there's more of a need to protect content if it's not behind paywalls. Tell me what you're seeing in the industry.
It is, in a nutshell, what we're seeing is that apps are the new middleware, and OTT is the new broadcast.
Okay.
So as you start to see set-top box become a smaller and smaller percentage of where content is consumed,
Sure.
you need to take protected content and put it to more and more devices, more and more browsers, more and more use cases, many different networks, and DRM is that flexible all-purpose glue that secures content anywhere, any place. And so we're seeing a lot of the traditional CAS providers having to diversify and very proactively shifting towards DRM and more specifically multi-DRM.
Now, in the enterprise space, which I spend a decent amount of time in, sandboxing, especially with bring your own device, sandboxing became a really big deal. DRM's different from sandboxing. So in this assumption, if I understand what you're saying, we're looking at a sort of completely unprotected device, so the content itself has to be highly protected.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and so it's what we call the host-style attacker model,
Okay.
where, I mean, in the vast majority of cases, your user is a good user. It's a valued customer. You want their experience to be good, seamless, transparent. You don't want to fall into the better than original traps that we had a decade ago, where you protected the content so heavily that users couldn't reach it at all.
Right.
But at the same time, you do have to keep tabs on where it is, how it is. And the trusted silicon is helping with that. More sophisticated apps are helping with that.
Sure.
Two-way IP connectivity is great because you can do a lot of dynamic checking and you can do a lot of dynamic reactions that you couldn't do in a one-way broadcast world.
True.
And so you kind of have a mix of all these different approaches. And that's one of the big parts of the strategy that we're preaching for content protection is it's not just locking it down.
Right.
It's securing it wherever it is, whenever it is, and whatever secure means in that particular context.
Okay.
So for enterprise, for example, it'll typically mean LDAP-based integration for the authentication. Some kind of measurement on who's watching it, when they watched it, where they're watching it.
Okay.
You do have some uses of DRM now with distance learning, for example. Where it starts to look much more like a pay TV service than it does an enterprise video conference.
Okay.
And so you start to see a merger of disciplines
right.
there.
And essentially that would be subscription-based or paywall.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the whole locking it down from a decade ago, and one of the things that sort of frustrated me in the industry, it still frustrates me, is if I have an Amazon Prime membership here in the States and I happen to travel abroad, I really would like to be able to watch my Amazon Prime content. The original argument had been licensing wouldn't allow them to let you see the content outside the US. But even the Amazon original content or the Netflix original content, which they completely own the licensing to, is not available to watch overseas. Do you think we'll get to the point where the devices will be trusted enough with some form of two-factor authentication to allow you to really actually take TV anywhere or see the content anywhere you are, as opposed to TV anywhere, meaning within the 48 contiguous states, et cetera, et cetera?
It's funny. I think I'm somewhat of a heretic on that front because I think the secure devices are already there.
Okay.
Samsung TVs are sold as much in India as in Vietnam, as in Afghanistan, as they are in Brazil or the US. Apple iPhones may be a little bit different distribution, but Chromecast is wildly global.
Right.
And so I think the devices are there.
Okay.
Where the gaps are, in my perspective, are in the law enforcement, in the tracking, in the tracing, and also not necessarily in the content agreements, but in the talent agreements or the resale agreements.
Okay, very good.
So part of it is the business aspect of it, part of it is the law enforcement partnership. Technology can go so far.
Sure.
Part of it is actually also the delivery side of it. And so if you look at the data transport rates in the US, they're dramatically lower compared to anywhere else in the world.
Absolutely.
So for a given price, if you're going to stream a certain volume of content,
Right.
you kind of have to look at those those balances too. So I think it is definitely growing. The growth for anyone is outside the US. We're a very saturated market here.
Right, absolutely.
But whether you can take growth and make it profitable, that's really where I think the disconnect is right now.
Well, and I think, you have expat communities of all different flavors. You have iPlayer, for the BBC, and people who are paying the license fee, but they can't necessarily consume the content outside. But you mentioned data transport rates, so that gives us a beautiful segment to HEVC. So HEVC has been an area you focused on. Had a conversation yesterday with a company that wants to create a survey and do a report, kind of like I've done with some other companies. And their basic statement is, it's time for HEVC. What's your take on whether that's sort of reality, or whether the licensing issues or technical issues or playback devices still need to mature to be able to get us to a point where HEVC is
So I
used?
think I would take a step back and say it's time for a successor to AVC. Right?
Okay.
AVC has taken us AVC has taken us very, very far.
All right.
It's an
Well, that's
algorithm.
a great political answer. It's time for something else. I'm not going to tell you what the something
I
else.
will in a
Okay.
second, but the fundamental of the problem is that AVC is very, very good for SD.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty good for HD. And if you throw a lot of computational cycles at it, as of today, you're still able to get as much out of AVC as you
Right.
theoretically could out of HEVC.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I worked for about 7 months as a strategy officer for a company that does video optimization, and they were able to essentially give you HEVC bandwidth levels for 1080p.
You have all the cool jobs.
Yeah, I don't know. But 4K seems to present a bit of an
It is a
interesting
bigger
challenge.
problem. And so what happens with HEVCs in the ideal situation, right? And I was one of the first people to get on the soapbox and say, we've learned our lesson with licensing.
Right.
We don't expect it to be an issue with HEVC. It was all set to absolutely skyrocket. And we keep, internally at Frost, we keep a directory of who's made announcements and who
Right.
shipped products.
Right.
And between 2014 and 2015, we saw this massive drop. Where everyone who had announced plans in 2014 suddenly put them on hold in
Right.
2015. And the reason was the licensing snafus that started
Yeah.
to come up. Now, I understand where the tech companies are coming from, because you've got millions and millions of dollars in MPEG-2 royalty revenues that
sure.
are drying up.
Sure.
So how do you keep an old school business running and profitable? However, this is the age of the internet, and try telling Cisco and Google that they are going to be beholden to a couple of IP houses,
Right.
where they've got billions of dollars of R&D resources of their own.
Right.
So I think, and I said this at Streaming Media West last year, I think there's a window of opportunity where HEVC can still get its act together
Right.
and start to leverage the massive investments that we have.
But
the
if
device,
it doesn't,
if it doesn't, then VP9 is here, and AV1 is right around the corner. And for the next 2 years, AVC is not all that bad.
Right.
4K is aspirational. VR, I think, is aspirational. But you don't really have the business model or the bandwidth or the content creation. Those blockades are still there.
It's interesting that you say that, because so the 2014-15, where the licensing snafu happened, I wrote an article around that time where we sort of went back and looked at what happened with H.264. And you remember there was VP7, I think, at that point.
Yeah.
There were a couple other competing codecs. Once the AVC group got their act together on licensing, there were sort of some sacrificial lambs on the table of On2, et cetera, et cetera. My thinking was, when we came forward, that with the VP9, AV1, that it would sort of force the licensing to that group to go back and get their act together. It hasn't necessarily seemed to happen.
I think it hasn't, because you have two distinct ecosystems now. You've got the linear broadcast ecosystem,
True.
where HEVC is still going to be the way forward.
Okay.
You've got governments negotiating down control, content royalty rates and
Right.
so forth. But the problem is that's such a small percentage
True,
of our overall
the
ecosystem now.
That's true.
So you've got this ubiquitous AVC that's common across enterprise and media entertainment. I don't think we're going to have that luxury moving forward. That
Okay.
age came and went. So when Adobe put AVC into Sorensen, AVC into Flash, that
Flash,
essentially
right.
brought those two ecosystems together.
Right, it
And
did.
we had this golden era.
Well, and
of
Gary
growth.
Williams taking the ITU standards, because I was
Yes.
in video conferencing, and we
Yes.
had H.264 long
Bringing
before we
them
had
together,
it in
exactly.
MPEG. So what's fascinating to what you say is, when we put the level 3 survey report out a couple weeks ago, it was very clear that overall, the respondents said that 4K broadcast was going down in importance for them and 4K streaming was rising for them. So you say it's aspirational. To me, I wonder if we're going to reach a point where if HEVC doesn't get its act together and AV1 continues to improve, that essentially, as you say, we have a replacement for ABC, but it may not be HEVC.
I think that's true, and that's the other difference between OTT and traditional linear broadcast. You don't have billions of dollars of equipment out there and sitting there. You can change formats
and you're
on
not
a dime.
and you're not required to meet sort of the same standard as an
this
NTSC
is
broadcast.
the internet age, right? Just repurpose a whole bunch of servers and rewrite a JavaScript, and you're kind of done. The battle would, in theory, have been fought at the processor level, but those guys have enough footprint now that they can hedge their bets.
Right.
So I still think the preferred alternative is to use HEVC, and maybe they will get their act together. But if they don't, you've got a very credible plan B. And regardless, I think the power base has shifted away.
And even in the time from 2015 to now, with these quality optimizations of AVC, we're finding it has more legs than we thought that it did necessarily.
Because the CPUs give it a lot more room to grow.
So what happens, let's say tomorrow HEVC licensing gets dealt with, would we start to see significant adoption because devices are capable of playing it back, or would it still take time to get sort of the licensing deals into silicon?
I think it should be fine. There's a lot of capable but not enabled out there. Apple is a classic example of that. HEVC wasn't FaceTime, now it's not, but it's capable, it's just not enabled.
Absolutely.
I think the ones, a couple of sticking points, and that the DRM stuff may have to be done, libraries may have to be re-encrypted, some of the analytics, some of the data gathering, some of the caching, but those are little problems and people know how to deal with them.
Right, okay. And then what, as we sort of think moving beyond, when do you sort of expect 4K will move from aspirational to sort of standard, especially if you're saying set-top boxes, consumption on set-top boxes compared to the overall is dropping? Do you think we will see sort of standard with 4K, or do you think it's going to be that ultimately everybody's still comfortable with 1080p on smaller devices? I
think it depends. So HD, if you look at it, it had an initial surge, but then you still have SD channels 10 years later. It will creep up there. One of the very immediate applications of 4K workflows is actually VR.
Okay.
Because for an HD VR view, you have a 4K workflow.
Right, exactly.
And so we're seeing 4K workflows fly off the shelves, not because of the linear 4K experience, but because of the immersive VR experiences.
And are you seeing traction in VR video?
We are.
Okay, interesting. Because I've talked to a number of companies who've said, got a lot of tire kickers, but we're not necessarily selling a whole lot of, and this is more the service delivery side than the, say, production side.
Yeah, so it's an interesting statistic, and if you go to Google and look at 360 videos, there's about 500,000 of them now, up from 250,000 maybe 6 months ago.
Okay.
Only 8,000 of them are actually longer than 10 minutes. So yes, in the grand scheme where you're streaming 1 billion HD minutes of video a day, this is still small. But if you look at the trajectory, it's promising.
Okay.
And if you look at the user engagement levels, it's promising. I think the key difference is, can you cross the bridge between mainstream and mass market?
Right, absolutely.
And that's where...
Yeah, that's a pretty big chasm to go across. One final question, 1080p, HDR, HFR, and for the audience, HFR is high frame rate, HDR is high dynamic range, so more like film than video. Where are you seeing traction there? Because I'm hearing from delivery companies that they have paying customers who want HDR, HFR, where they don't necessarily want 4K or VR video.
That's exactly spot on.
Okay.
HD with HDR is getting much more favorable reviews than just straight 4K, and it's much, much cheaper to deploy, much more immediately responsive from the customer.
The customer can sense a significant difference. Interesting. So do you think that will continue to give legs to AVC for a period of time, or do you think that HEVC with HDR and HFR might also be a potential
I think, at least from what I'm hearing from the encoder vendors as well as the middleware and the app developers, HDR plays nicer with HEVC. It's more clean in terms of the workflows. You have fewer workarounds.
Right.
So I suspect it's going to be in that context.
Okay. And high frame rates, of course. Obviously, the higher the frame rate, the more data you've got. Therefore, the better for HEVC or AV.
But sometimes that actually favors AVC because the implementations are much more efficient than the HEVC decoders. So with high frame rate, it kind of goes back and forth. But for HDR, HEVC is better.
Well, we've actually done almost 8 minutes now. We could probably do another 30 or so. But this is Avni from Frost & Sullivan. I'm Tim Siglin, contributing editor with Streaming Media Magazine. Thank you all for watching this interview.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's.
That went by fast.